Okay, I might get things underway. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ullrich Ecker. So Uli and I have a bit of history. Very long time ago in a galaxy far, far away called Adelaide, Uli came and visited me with the, to possibly come and work with me for a little while. Then he discovered that I wasn't a believer in the dual process approach to recognition memory. And I think he thought that was a kind of form of heresy. And so he just kept flying and went across to Western Australia. And he's been there ever since, I think. So Uli has a background in memory, but more recently has been very focused on misinformation and the kind of factors that influence the way that people believe, or what influences people's beliefs. So I think that's what he's going to talk about today. So take it away, Uli.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a great pleasure. So yeah, I'll talk about the continued influence of misinformation, which means that misinformation, once you've encoded it and it seems plausible enough, it will continue to influence people's memory and particularly their reasoning. That's what I'm sort of mostly looking at in their decision making, even after people have received a clear correction. And even when people understand, believe, and later remember that correction. Now, there's a little asterisk on the belief. So initially in 2010, we ran a little study where we found that whether or not someone believed the correction didn't actually change the patterns that we saw in terms of how much they relied on the corrected misinformation later on. But as the footnote says, it's a bit more complicated than that, and I'll go into that in my later slides. So we use all kinds of different materials in this work. So it can be real world myths. We look at politicians lying. We look at sort of common myths that go around, but we also use a lot of fictional materials just because that gives you great sort of experimental control. And most of the things I use are sort of fictional news reports where this is an example of that, where, you know, people might read a news report about a spike in seizures occurring somewhere in some hospital, and somewhere in that report there's a piece of critical information given that explains that event. So in this case, there might be the information given that the spike in seizures is caused by a new drug that's been rolled out. And then some people, but not others, receive a retraction of that information, in this case saying that, you know, there's no evidence been found, there's no relation between the new drug and the seizures. And then we measure people's memory, their inferential reasoning mainly, sometimes also their behavioral intentions and choices, and I'll speak a little bit more about that towards the very end of the talk. But most of the measures we use are sort of inferential reasoning measures. Memory questions are often just there to make sure people actually encode the materials and to see that there's no condition differences on that. So the inferential reasoning measures can take a whole, you know, a number of shapes. So we could ask them open-ended questions. In this case, you know, there's a spike in seizures. It's been allegedly caused by a new drug. What should authorities do now? So people can respond with whatever comes to their mind, and we count pretty much how often they refer to the critical information in their reasoning. Could be what would be a good headline for this report, or if we do it online, we use rating scales and say, you know, would drug causes seizures be a good headline for this report? Here's an example of a behavioral intentions question where we might ask them, okay, imagine you were prescribed this drug, would you take it? Okay, and again, we get people to rate, and we use a number of these items and we calculate some sort of inference score, and we look at the condition difference on that score. And this is sort of a prototypical finding. The y-axis here is arbitrary, really depends on what kind of questions you ask and how many of them, of course. And what we typically find is that if you give people a retraction compared to a group who receives no retraction, so they just received the critical information, the misinformation, what we see is that the retraction typically halves the number of references that people make to the retracted information. So when I talk about reliance on corrected misinformation, that's what I mean, the difference between that retraction group and some sort of baseline. Now, the baseline can be zero, as in this example. If you have, for example, a report where the cause of the event has low prior probability, where there's open-ended questions and you wouldn't assume that anyone would come up with this spontaneously, then the baseline can be zero. Often it's not zero. When we use rating scales, obviously people avoid the lower and upper ends of the scales a lot. or when there's innuendo in the story, or when it's a cause of the event that has a higher sort of prior probability. So it really depends. Often we use known misinformation control groups to get a better baseline. But in the example here, the baseline would be 0. So basically the effect is that even after people receive a correction, they're still influenced in their reasoning by the corrected misinformation. And that happens despite people demonstrably remembering the retraction, and in cases like this with fictional materials where they have no motivation to believe the initial incorrect version. And this is just a verbatim quote from one of the studies we ran with this drug, where we might ask the person what was the outcome of the review. So often we have a question in there targeting people's encoding and memory for the retraction itself. And they might reply, the new drug didn't cause the seizures after all. And then a minute later, we ask them what caused the seizures, and they might reply with the new drug. Okay, so there's this mutually inconsistent information being provided here. And that seems sort of irrational, but I don't think it would surprise too many of you that that's what people sometimes do. They use different representations or different pieces of information depending on what kind of questions you ask them, even if they're sort of, contradictory. Now, most of the literature and sort of the theorizing in this area has focused on cognitive factors and cognitive theories. So it's been argued that the continued influence effect, this ongoing reliance on corrected misinformation, is caused by a lack of integration of the correction with the initial misinformation model of the event, the mental model of the event. It's been argued that it's sort of a failure of memory updating, that we just struggle to keep our sort of representations up to date. Or it's been argued that it's a retrieval failure that happens at test, where sometimes you might just remember the misinformation, but you don't remember the correction, and that's where continued influence happens. And we've learned a lot about the effect through that theorizing. We've learned a lot about how to best sort of debunk misinformation, what kind of corrections work better and which ones don't work as well. So we've learned a lot about that, but in this talk and in sort of my recent research, I've been more interested in sort of social factors that influence the effect. So I'll talk about 4 different ones in this talk. I'll talk about the role of source credibility. I'll talk about the role of pre-existing attitudes and worldviews that people bring to the table, which is especially relevant if you use non-fictional materials like real-world myths and things that politicians say and so on. I'll look at the role of social norms, which is something that hasn't been investigated in this area until recently. And I'll briefly talk about continued influence in impression formation when it's not about an event or some causal interrelation in the world, but it's about a person and the formation of the impression that we build of that person. So starting with source credibility, I said earlier that in a 2010 study, we found no evidence that whether or not people believed in the retraction really mattered that much. But that was a very small study. So, people have been sort of questioning that. If you think about it, if you look at the persuasion literature, it's really well established that source credibility matters. So it seems quite obvious that the credibility of the source that provides a correction should also matter. But in this area, there's also findings that sort of go against that. For example, if you look at the credibility of news items, and the sources that provide those news items, so say the BBC versus some fringe online website that spreads fake news, you find that actually credibility of sources has surprisingly little effect in terms of what news items people believe. So that's sort of one hint that maybe source credibility isn't that important in all circumstances. There was a recent meta-analysis on the continued influence effect that suggested that source credibility matters for the misinformation, whether or not people believe the misinformation to start with, but not at all for the correction. And even though there was a couple of studies from my lab, or I should say Brian Swire's lab now in the States, in that meta-analysis, and we find that as well, that the source credibility seems to matter more for the misinformation than it does for the correction, I still wasn't really convinced that it shouldn't play any role at all for the correction. So that's why there's a really with a question mark there. The only study that's really looked into the credibility of a correction source was run by Jimika Gilroy and Lisa Garaci. And they found that trustworthiness matters, but not expertise. So often credibility is broken down to these 2 dimensions. And they published this finding in 2013 that they found the trustworthiness of the correction source matters, whether you trust them, but not their expertise. And again, we all, I think, hope and want to believe that expertise doesn't matter a little bit. So again, there's a really there. And also, not that I disagreed with their operationalization of expertise, but they treated expertise in that experiment more as, was the person involved in the incident? Could they witness what was going on? They didn't look at expertise in the sense of, well, you should look to a medical doctor if you're after a correction of medical misinformation, right? So in the study that I'm about to show, we looked at that sort of facet of expertise, if you so like. So here's some studies that say, you know, credibility doesn't seem to matter all that much. But then there's a study from last year by Andrea Ullrich and Gabriel Rudvansky, who suggested that continued influence of misinformation arises only if people do not believe the retraction. So they said, they ran a couple of studies and argued that if people believe the retraction, then they don't show any continued influence. Now, very small samples in that study, so wasn't terribly convinced by it, and I'm thinking, well, you know, is it everything? Is source credibility really everything? I don't know. I don't believe that either. So I don't believe it plays no role. I also don't believe that it's the absolute dominant factor. I always forget how to pronounce her Irish name, but I think it's Saoirse Kondesai at UNSW. She found with some Bayesian modeling that, or she suggested based on some Bayesian modeling, that this continued influence effect can actually be rational if people just happen to believe the misinformation more than the retraction, and that's something that I would underwrite 100%. And there's also some work by others having been done in the past that sort of suggests that you know, you can get belief polarization in a Bayesian network that can actually be explained through rational belief updating, just depending on which sources you trust and you don't trust. So there's an interesting sort of background that, you know, some people say source credibility doesn't matter at all. Some people say it matters a lot. And there's people in the middle who say, well, it matters, but it's not everything. And I wanted to find some evidence for that sort of middle ground. So this is a study we actually ran a while back, and I presented these data before at the 27 workshop, but there's a follow experiment that I'll present today as well. In the study, we manipulated the retraction sources' perceived trustworthiness and their expertise. So for example, we presented people with one of these fictional stories that there's a new drug coming to market and that there's some safety concerns around that drug, and hence you know, that's been stopped. It's not being brought to market due to those safety concerns. And then that is retracted, saying, no, there's no safety concerns regarding the drug. It's all going ahead. That's misinformation. And what we varied here was the expertise, the perceived expertise and the perceived trustworthiness of that retraction source. So if you have low trust sources like, you know, the director of the pharma company selling the drug who actually, you know, has an obvious vested interest, you wouldn't trust them because, you know, they have a vested interest. Same with the pharma industry lobbyist who you wouldn't trust and who may also not have any relevant expertise. Whereas people who you trust might be a local nurse, you know them, you trust them. Do they have the expertise? Probably not, but maybe you'd be influenced by what they say. Or you'd have an independent professor who hopefully is seen as reasonably trustworthy because they're independent and also have obviously the expertise that is relevant. So what, you know, which retractions work best? Well, these are the data. At the left, we have the control group that received no retraction. And then we have 4 retractions here that are low expertise, low trustworthiness, low expertise, high trustworthiness, high expertise, low trustworthiness, high expertise, high trustworthiness. So what we find is that there's an effective trustworthiness, but there's absolutely no effective expertise whatsoever. So that's a bit disheartening, I think. I think we all would like to believe that people listen to experts, but what really seems to matter is whether or not you trust people. The actual expertise, the subject matter expertise doesn't seem to really matter that much at all. So that replicates Gilroy and Garachi's finding, even though they use a different operationalization of expertise. And it kind of suggests that you can be credible as a low expertise source if you're trusted, but if you're low on trustworthiness, then you're not seen as credible and people don't trust you. So I guess it does make sense to an extent, and it suggests that there's you know, sort of a hierarchy of these dimensions, that they're not equally important, but that people weight trustworthiness greater than expertise. But if you look back at the data, and I I need to point out the truncated y-axis here, that, those effects are really quite small. So the retractions didn't actually work particularly well. Now, it's not entirely surprising. We do sometimes have studies where retractions don't have any impact at all, especially if they're really terse and just, this is wrong. If that's all the information you give people, that's not particularly powerful. We know that if you give people more detailed refutations that explain why something is wrong and what the correct information is, they're much more impactful. So it's not entirely surprising. But we also found in this study, we did give people an additional belief rating at the end, where we asked them to rate their belief in both the retractions and the misinformation that we provided to them. And we found that people believed the retractions less than they believed the misinformation. So that's some evidence actually that the credibility of the retractions might be an influential factor. So here, those ratings, you can see a quite clear difference between people's belief in the critical information, the misinformation that is being retracted, and the retraction itself. And that's pretty similar across conditions, actually. There's a slight interaction there, maybe. I don't know, I don't remember if that's significant or not. It doesn't really matter. You can see it's quite significant across conditions. We also did some linear mixed effects modeling here, showing that retraction belief did in fact predict misinformation reliance. So we're finding some evidence that the credibility of the retraction does matter. Now, unfortunately, in this experiment, we didn't have that no misinformation control condition, so we don't really know where the baseline is. In this experiment, it's probably not 0 because there were a few rating scale items in there, and so on. So we can look at what happens if we restrict cases to those cases where people actually believe the correction, but we can't say for sure. It's a fair bit off 0, but we can't say for sure whether that's significantly different from a no misinformation control condition. We just don't have a good baseline from that experiment. All right, so in the second experiment, we changed two things. One is that in the first experiment and also in that Ullrich and Radbransky study, people rated their belief in the misinformation and the retraction immediately after they answered those reasoning measures. So there is a possibility that they sort of retrofit their belief ratings to whatever they did with the reasoning measures, right? So if they were influenced by the misinformation in the reasoning measures, and then they remember, oh yeah, actually there was a retraction, then they're going to tell us that they didn't believe the retraction, right? That would sort of make sense. So we thought maybe it's better to flip that around and ask them those belief questions as they encode each statement. Now, of course, that could also carry over then the other way around. There could be a carryover effect from the belief ratings onto the inference measures. But we think that's probably less likely because A, we got people in this experiment to rate the credibility of each and every statement, not just the retraction statements, not just the misinformation statements or the padding that we give people, the storyline. And also there's a distractor task between the study and the test phase. So there's a bigger temporal gap between those two measures. So we argued that it's better to do it this way. And also we added a no misinformation control condition to this experiment so we can actually see whether if people strongly believe the correction, do they still show continued influence that sits above baseline? All right, here are the results from that study. We have here the no misinformation control on the left. So that's where people don't ever hear about the drug safety concerns, for example. So that's the baseline. It's obviously not 0. It's around 3. Here's the no retraction condition. This is the condition where you are given the misinformation, but you're not given a retraction. So that should be sort of the highest bar. It's obviously not. The retraction in this study didn't work whatsoever. So we have a low trustworthiness retraction here and a high trustworthiness retraction there. Yes, this is numerically higher than the no retraction. So there seems to be some sort of backfire effect. This is one of those, p equals 0.05 cases. So I wouldn't place too much weight on that. I would just say that the retractions were just ineffective in this study. And as I said earlier, that sometimes does happen. Okay, so what did we do with this? First of all, the retractions were ineffective. Again, they were very terse and not very powerful. Maybe there was some heightened skepticism because they had to rate their belief in each and every statement that they read. So maybe that changed the way people approached the task and they were more skeptical of the retractions. Again, we find in those credibility ratings that the retractions are rated as less credible than the misinformation. Not a huge difference on a 0 to 3 scale, but you know, it is what it is. So not entirely surprising, given the findings from experiment 1, that people tended to believe the misinformation more than the retractions, and hence that null effect of the retraction makes sense. Again, some linear mixed effects modeling where we showed that retraction credibility again predicted people's misinformation reliance, at least in the retraction conditions. So more evidence that retraction credibility matters. But we do find in this study that even if people give the retraction the top belief score, they strongly believe the retraction to be, you know, come from a credible source and be credible, even in that case, we find significant continued influence. So this dashed line here is where the high trustworthiness retractions with a belief rating of 3 sit. So they're clearly off the no misinformation control. They're clearly higher than baseline. So there's continued influence effect in this case, even in a case where people believe the correction. Now, would I like some stronger evidence? Would I like to see that evidence in a case where the retraction actually worked, at least, you know, partially? Yes. But it is what it is. The reviewers are probably going to tell me that I need to run another experiment to convince them. We'll see what they say. I'm expecting reviews back any minute now. So maybe they'll be here by the end of the talk. So to wrap that up, we find that correction belief predicts misinformation reliance. We find that corrections tend to be more effective if they come from trustworthy sources. We find that expertise doesn't seem to matter much, which is a bit disheartening, but we replicate earlier findings on that. And we find that a continued influence effect can still arise in situations where people actually believe the correction. And as I said earlier, stronger evidence will be nice. Okay, so now I'll move on to the second point, which is what is the role of pre-existing attitudes? Now, I'll just take a sip of tea. This has received quite a bit of attention ever since a study by Brent Nyhan and Jason Reifler, who find what they term the worldview backfire effect, meaning that if you've encoded misinformation that supports your own worldview, sometimes a correction can backfire, can ironically strengthen the misconception that you hold. And Nyhan and Reifler used a range of things, including you know, the belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And they found this worldview backfire effect only in politically conservative people. They kind of tried with one experiment to find it in more liberal people. They only found it in conservatives. The effects weren't huge. They weren't super convincing. But, you know, the paper's been cited about 1,800 times. So it's made quite a splash, and it's had a big influence on the field. A lot of people who do debunking are scared of this backfire effect. They're scared of making things worse inadvertently, right? So it's kind of important. So I was always a bit surprised that with my sort of fictional event reports, I don't find any evidence for this effect. So, you know, if I look at stories about an Islamist terror attack where I had data on people's Islamophobia, or looked at a story involving an Aboriginal robber and I looked at people's racial prejudice, I didn't find those effects. I did find that people who are sort of more racist refer more often to the fact that the robber in that story was an Aboriginal, right? So they do use that worldview consistent information more in their reasoning. It's just that worldview doesn't seem to have an effect on how effective the correction is, if that makes sense. So I thought, well, maybe it's because I'm using these fictional reports about sort of episodic events, right, that are sort of one-off things. Maybe we need to look at something more general. So in a paper we published last year, we looked at still a fictional report, but a more general report where the critical information was that there's more political misconduct in one or the other party, a left-wing or a right-wing party. This was actually done in Australia, so it was the Labor and the Liberal Party. And that was then retracted or not. And we had participants, undergraduate participants, who were pre-screened to be either supporting the Labor or the Liberal Party. And what we found was this. So this is the Labor group, the Labor participants, left-wing. And you can see that the retraction worked, both when the misinformation was that politicians of the Labor Party were more likely to embezzle funds and be involved in misconduct, or if the misinformation was that it was the politicians from the Liberal Party, right? So obviously left-wing participants who support Labour, to them, the information that the Liberal politicians are embezzling is something they like more. That's the black curve. So the retraction isn't quite as effective as the retraction of the misinformation they don't like, namely that it's the politicians that they support who are doing the embezzling, which is the green line, right? So we see some slight interaction here, which suggests there's a worldview effect, ever so slightly. If we look at the right-wing group, we find the same kind of interaction. We find it's a little bit stronger. And what we find is that if you try and retract a piece of misinformation that a right-wing person likes, which in this case would be the Labour politicians are the bad guys, then the retraction actually becomes ineffective. And we replicated that in a second experiment in that paper, which didn't have all those 4 conditions, but we replicated that basic pattern that retractions always seem to work unless you retract something that a conservative person actually wants to believe, if that makes sense. So that fit very well with my own sort of politically liberal, by which I mean sort of left-wing mindset. So gladly published that. And I thought, oh, wow, let's now replicate this in the US. It's going to be even bigger, even better, because everything in the US is bigger and better, but we expected the effects to be even more pronounced in the US because there's more sort of political polarization in the US. And we used a larger sample here. We went online, used a panel service to get pre-screened Democrats and Republicans, and we turned it from Labour and Liberal to Democrats and Republicans. And what we found is this. And as you will easily see, there are absolutely no interactions in this. We did not replicate that effect. We found that a retraction always worked to pretty much the same degree, whatever group we tested and whatever the worldview congruence of the misinformation was. So again, the dark bars are higher than the light gray bars, which means that yes, people do prefer to refer to information in their reasoning that is congruent with their own worldview, right? So if you support the Democrats and the misinformation was that the Republicans embezzle a lot of money, you like to mention that, you like to point the finger, but there's no effect on the retraction effectiveness itself, right? So the retraction reduces people's reliance on the misinformation, but there's absolutely no interactions. The Bayes ratio here in favor of a main effects model over one that has that crucial 3-way interaction is about 1300. So one of the clearest sort of null effects that I've seen. I didn't like that, to be brutally honest. I'd like to believe that the conservative people are very biased and irrational and whatnot, but the data are the data. So we're now trying to publish that. And that's one of the reminders why it's so important to do replication work. So again, reasoning was generally biased towards worldview congruent information. That evidence for this asymmetry, that it's the conservative people where the retractions don't work if they're attacking worldview congruent misinformation, seems to be diminishing, not just in the misinformation literature, but there's also a bunch of other studies, sort of the wider motivated reasoning literature, that seem to show over the last year or two that a lot of this evidence for asymmetry, that it's, we always find these irrational effects on the political right, doesn't really hold up very well if you try and replicate that. For example, that worldview backfire effect that I mentioned earlier just doesn't replicate. And there's, I think, 2 or 3 studies now that have failed to replicate it. I only mentioned the Wooden Porter here now because they use the exact same materials. And they ran another study together with Nyan and Reifler where they also couldn't replicate the effect. Brian Iswaya has pointed out that evidence for this backfire effect has only been found, or most often only been found, in sort of exploratory subsample analyses, or when people use sort of notoriously unreliable one-item measures. Also, my selective retraction ineffectiveness wasn't backfire, but it was sort of, some evidence for that asymmetry also didn't replicate. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I've been scratching my head a fair bit across that. My best speculation is that maybe the samples in our undergraduate Australian study may have differed on what is called political identity centrality. What that means is how central your political worldview is to your overall identity. And my hunch is that undergraduates, their default worldview is to be left-leaning, right? But you will get a lot of undergraduates who are sort of left-leaning, but they're not particularly political people. It's not really central to their identity. If you ask them, what's your political identity? They'll go, oh, I guess I'm left-leaning, but it's not a central part of their identity. Whereas if, as an undergraduate, you identify as conservative, I ask you, you say, yes, I support, the Liberal Party, I'm conservative. My hunch is that that is probably more important to your identity, to your overall identity. So maybe there was this difference in political identity centrality that drove the difference that we observed in those reasoning effects. Whereas in the US sample, that was run by a panel service, so that the sample should probably be better equated on that dimension. I'm not sure if that really makes sense. Maybe you can tell me your opinion on that later, but I really struggle to understand why else we didn't replicate that effect. Now that leaves the field, however, with a bit of a conundrum, because there's also people who are trying really, really hard to find actual rejection of scientific evidence in real life on the left, and they can't find it, right? They look at anti-vaccine stuff, they look at GM foods, and they tend to find that it's usually right-wing people who reject scientific evidence. So there's this asymmetry in the real world, right, that we struggle to really explain through our lab work. So that's going to be important for future research to look at, I think. Okay, moving on to the third. I promise the last two are not going to be as long. Social norms. So, we know that social norms are important. For example, if you provide or communicate to people expert consensus on something like climate change, we know that's a powerful tool to address misconceptions. We know that there's normative influences on attitudes, stereotypes, behaviors, and so on. We know that people regulate their expressed beliefs in order to achieve social acceptance or avoid social exclusion. So we know that social norms matter, just no one has ever actually looked at it when it comes to corrections of misinformation. So what we did in the first study that I'll talk about is we provided people with an attitude congruent claim, which when I mean attitude congruent, I mean attitude congruent on average. So we tested undergraduates. We piloted a few claims. We found that undergraduates, by and large, agree that a slight increase in refugee uptake will boost the economy. That's an example claim. There were others. So we've tried to find claims that were sort of predictions going into the future, so we could easily refute them, that we knew the average undergraduate would agree with. Now, we used attitude congruent claims because we didn't know that my worldview stuff wouldn't replicate, and also because those are the misconceptions that tend to be hardest to correct, right? If people sort of want to believe something, and despite the evidence that I just showed earlier, that was sort of the hunch that they're more difficult to correct, and hence we chose claims that are attitude congruent. Then we gave participants an attitude incongruent norm. So we told them that only 37 out of 100 peers would actually endorse this claim. That's entirely made up. It would be closer to 70, but that's what we gave people because we wanted an attitude incongruent norm. Then we gave people a refutation of that claim, say, no, if we increase refugee uptake, it's going to destroy the economy. And we gave them a post-refutation norm as well, saying, okay, after receiving this refutation, the number of students endorsing this claim has now dropped to 19, right? And we tested whether this had any impact. We had private versus public conditions, meaning that either we assured people that their responses would remain confidential, or that there would be a group discussion at the end, which then actually also took place, where their responses might be, made not public, but a subject of discussion in that group setting. So what we find, I apologize for I wanted to replace this figure, but I forgot that yesterday was Father's Day, so I didn't have as much time as I wanted to. So I just chopped this out of an honest thesis. So apologies for that. But what we find is that there's a small but significant effect of just giving people the norm that reduces the endorsement of this claim, the belief that the claim is true by a little bit. But the refutation has a bit of a stronger effect, again, keeping in mind the truncated y-axis here. So that's, first evidence that norms matter a little bit. And if we look at the refutation, if we look at whether or not it was accompanied by a norm and whether the participants were in a public or a private condition, we find that what I'm plotting here is belief change. So it dropped from pre-manipulation belief, so hence, it's negative. So people reduce their belief in the claim after the refutation, and that drop is largest if there was a post-refutation norm given that sort of amplified the refutation, and people were in a public space where they thought that their expressed beliefs might be, other people might be aware of what those are. Again, it's not a huge effect. This is, if I remember correctly, a significant interaction, but it's obviously not very, very big, so I wouldn't put too much weight on it. But it's sort of in line with that notion that norms seem to have some sort of impact on people's belief expressions. We then tried something different. Instead of just giving them sort of a point norm, we tried distributed norms. For reasons I won't have time to go into, they were either narrow or wide. So this is what they looked like. So rather than saying, 34 out of 100 of your peers endorsed the claim, we actually gave them the fictional claim endorsement ratings. So in this case, it would be a very narrow distribution. So we sampled from two normal distributions with the same mean, but differences in standard deviation. We got this narrow and this wide distribution. So participants would get the claim, and then they would get either a refutation, or they would get this norm or the combination. So this norm would tell them, okay, so out of 25 other students, no one's really believed or endorsed the claim, right? They're all sitting around 15 here. Or, no one has endorsed the claim. There's a couple of people sort of, in the middle, but by and large, students seem to reject this claim. As I said, people either received a refutation or a norm or both. It was sort of run as two parallel experiments, where in one, people got a refutation or a narrow norm or a wide norm, and the other one, they got a refutation or refutation combined with a narrow norm or refutation combined with a wide norm. Again, this is sort of pre-post design where people have rated their belief twice, and we only did the public condition because that's where we expected the effects to be largest. So again, I'm plotting belief change scores here, dropping down from 0. They're all negative, so that makes a lot of sense. Just a reminder again that these two conditions here are actually identical. Both these groups just received a refutation of the claim. The differences between the light and dark grey bars only lie in the norm conditions, where the light grey bars here, people received only the norm with no refutation. And the dark grey bars here, they received both the refutation and the norm. So basically what this graph tells you is that people change their belief most, they reduce their belief in the refuted claim most, if they receive both a refutation and a norm that amplifies that refutation. So to conclude from that, norms seem to have some effect on people's belief expressions, and people seem to be influenced more by refutations if these refutations are amplified by congruent normative information. So maybe not, the most surprising finding in the world, but again, more evidence that this is not just a cognitive effect. It's also influenced by social factors. Okay, the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about a study that at least Andy and maybe a couple of other people already know about, where we looked at continued influence in impression formation. So moving away from sort of event reports and myths to how people build impressions of others. Why did we do that? Well, there's quite a few studies who show that there's continued influence with false allegations. If you make a false allegation and you withdraw it, that can, mud sticks, and it will continue to affect how people view an accused person. But then also there's a pretty large literature in sort of the reading arena, which claims that readers very easily update their impressions all the time, and that there shouldn't actually be much continued influence. So there's more to that story. It's more complicated than that, but that's sort of the basic backdrop. So in this study, we gave people information about an alleged peer, who we called John. In a second experiment, we varied it and called the person either John or Vladimir, based on some, I hope there's no Vladimir in the audience, but we did some pilot work showing that Vladimir was the name most easily associated with domestic violence actions, which was the negative misinformation we presented in this study. So we tried a variety of different names from different cultures, focusing on those that have particularly bad domestic violence records, and Vlad blew everyone else out of the water. So you make of that what you will, but yeah, that's why we chose that name in that study. We gave them behavior descriptions. So basically we told them that we had interviewed acquaintances of John and just asked them to provide whatever behaviors they remembered from the last 2 or 4 weeks that they had observed John engage in, right? So they could have been only neutral. And when I say neutral, they were sort of slightly negative, sometimes slightly positive. So these would be things like, okay, John played a game of tennis, John got a speeding ticket, John gave a clever response in a seminar at uni or whatever, right? So slightly negative, slightly positive, or quite boring, neutral. So a range of those descriptions. Then in another condition, we included one negative behavior, which is that John slapped his girlfriend during an argument. And then in the third condition, we provided the same information, but then retracted the negative behavior. Everyone actually received some retractions, but in the neutral condition, it was sort of, actually, he didn't play a game of tennis. And we told participants that we had brought the 4 acquaintances and John together and then discussed those behaviors. And, some of them, there were new behaviors given. There were some that were retracted. And in, that neutral, negative, retracted condition, it was that negative behavior that was retracted. We then asked people to give likability and aggressiveness ratings. We asked them to make behavior predictions. How would John behave in a particular situation? And we presented them with one of these faces and asked them, said, this is John. How do you rate his face and sort of attractiveness and trustworthiness, things like that. Okay, what did we find? This is likability. So we find that people sit slightly above midpoint in their likability in the control condition, where they just get sort of boring neutral information. That drops when they receive the negative information, but it makes a full recovery after they receive the retraction. So no continued influence, which sort of happens quite rarely. So was slightly excited by that. Finally, retraction managed to offset the effect of the negative misinformation entirely. And we find that in experiment 2 as well, where we had an exact replication with John or with Vladimir, the name made no difference whatsoever. In fact, the replication was so close, and these are the data for aggressiveness, where negative misinformation will make people rate the person as more aggressive, but the retraction fully offsets that. Negative misinformation will make people to make behavior predictions that are more negative, more aggressive, but the retraction fully offsets that. So in fact, the replication was so close that for a second I freaked out and thought I'd analyzed the wrong data or something, but then I checked and I hadn't. But that's rare that you see such a close replication. But reassuring, that's for sure. And just a note, I'm not showing the face valence ratings. Reviewers didn't like them as much. They said, they're not truly implicit and so on and so forth. But we do actually find some continued influence on people's face ratings. So the base factor there across experiments was about 7, so some reasonably strong evidence that there was a difference between the control and the retraction condition, where the retraction didn't fully offset the impact of the negative misinformation on the face ratings. But yeah, my focus here was more on the fact that we didn't find any continued influence on person impressions. Now, in a recent honours study led by Nick Fay, Amy Mickelberg looked at the temporal dynamics of this. So what I'm showing here is 27 trials, meaning that 27 behaviours were given about John, and we track how the impression rating on a -50 to +50 scale tracks over time. So people initially form based on neutral information, they form a slightly positive impression of a person. Then we give them some positive information, which I can't actually recall what that was. People see the person as more positive. If we give them the negative information, which in this case was that they cheated on their partner with the partner of their best friend, I think, people really don't like that. So that leads to a big drop in the impression rating. Some slight recovery, but it never recovers, never goes back to baseline. That's why we had these 14 extra trials to see if there might be a return to baseline, but there's not. So if you learn something negative about a person, that certainly does seem to stick. But if you retract that negative information, saying actually that wasn't true, it makes an immediate and full recovery. There's even a bit of overshoot here. And then it returns back to baseline. So a third replication of that finding, pretty much, that if you give people a very negative piece of information about a person and then you retract it, there seems to be no evidence that the mud is sticking. They make a full recovery to baseline. So you can ask, why is that the case? Well, it might be that people hesitate to make negative interpersonal judgments. They don't want to rate someone negatively based on something that that might not be true. but it also might be differences in how we represent things and how we update things. So if you think about the difference between those events that I talked about and this person impression, if you retract the cause of an event, you're sort of left with a mental model of that event that is incomplete, right? You don't know what caused the event. If the drug doesn't cause the spike in the seizures, then well, what does? So the retraction presents sort of a threat to model coherence, right? So by their very nature, events sort of demand an explanation. If you take that away from me, then I don't know what's going on. So it's almost rational, I would say, to kind of hold on to the initial cause that was presented, even if it's been retracted afterwards. Whereas if you do that with a person, well, if you learn that one behavior that the person allegedly had shown wasn't true, that doesn't break your mental model of that person, right? That's still intact. There's no threat to coherence, especially because in these studies, that negative behavior was sort of out of context. It wasn't linked to any other negative behaviors. It didn't serve any sort of predictive purpose. So that's the obvious next step, that one of the things we want to do is use something that is more relevant in terms of explaining other behaviors, or more painting a picture of a person as someone who is a person who would actually plausibly commit that kind of behavior. Okay, so to wrap up, continued influence of misinformation seems to be shaped somewhat by social influences. We talked about perceived source trustworthiness playing a role. The credibility of corrections seem to matter for people's level of misinformation reliance. Peer norms seem to influence the beliefs you express in terms of corrected misinformation. There seems to be less influence of worldview than we previously thought, which I think is very interesting. And there seems to be little evidence for continued influence in impression formation, which could be due to social factors, but it could also be due to cognitive factors to do with how we represent things in our mind. So the next steps will be hopefully to find stronger evidence for continued influence, even if people strongly believe a correction. I'd like to do more work on that. Someone needs to address the issue that we find no worldview effects, and we find symmetry in motivated reasoning more and more in the lab, but we have this asymmetry in science denial, where it's mostly conservative people who engage in the denial of scientific evidence. And we need to do more work on this person impression stuff, use more, better integrated, more predictive behaviors, and maybe use, instead of just having participants rate one person, maybe move them to something like 2 alternative forced choice tasks, where they need to choose a person, as we do in elections, for example, right? We choose one person over the other. More generally, I'd like to differentiate more between different types of misinformation. Implied misinformation, where you're not actually telling a lie, but you're misleading people, versus more explicit misinformation. I'd like to focus more on inoculating people, so explaining to people the misleading argumentation strategies that are being used out there in order to better prepare them for when they encounter misinformation, rather than just waiting until they're misinformed and then trying to run after them and debunk the misinformation after the fact. So be a bit more proactive. John Cook is developing an exciting new game based on this Cranky Uncle book. Cranky Uncle is the prototypical climate change denier, where we're trying through a free app game to get people to engage with the techniques used by science deniers, so they can better identify those misleading argumentation strategies, like relying on anecdotal evidence, cherry picking, those kind of things. So when they build that resilience, that sort of information literacy, they're better prepared to deal with misinformation when they encounter it. And finally, I'd like to do more on looking at misinformation effects on actual behaviors rather than just reasoning tasks. So here's some very, very recent data where we gave people some COVID-19 misinformation about vitamin E being a potential cure, and measuring their willingness to pay for a vitamin E supplement. And what we find there is that we contrasted a weak refutation with a strong refutation. The weak refutation would use information that is provided by mainstream media or by health organizations such as the CDC, where they always try and be very conservative and careful in their refutations of misinformation. And we show that if you actually call a spade and you explain to people how they're being misled by the misinformation, that you get a much stronger effect in terms of reducing people's willingness to pay for the alleged cure. And just in case you're wondering why there's no stronger effect between control and misinformation here, we give people misinformation claiming that vitamin E is a cure versus not. The control condition is not a neutral control condition. It sort of talks about vitamins being important for health and boosting, well, supporting the immune system and so on. So it's not a fair comparison there. The really interesting effect is between the weak and strong refutations here. And we also had a sharing measure here where we show that the strong refutation really brings down people's inclination to share that type of misinformation online compared to the misinformation group here. Yeah, so that was it. I would like to thank you very much. I went a little bit long, apologies for that. But yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. So thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks, Uli. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, so we might start with those. What I might do is I might get the people who wrote the questions to actually ask their questions. So is it Jelly? Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, that's it. But you can call me Greg. And this was really just the second section on asymmetry, political asymmetry not being replicated. And I thought that this response, maybe because there's demand effects here, that the right-wingers are cautious of just the whole context of conducting an academic study as such. And so therefore they edit their responses, especially on misinformation correctness, right? There's a higher chance for demand effects anyway, because you have the initial bit and then the refutation. And so they might think that these liberals are after them to check, to catch them, that they don't update their views. And so because of that, they update it more.
Well, they say they do, yeah. That's a great comment. And one that yeah, I totally agree with you that that's a difficult situation to get out of, because as researchers, whatever research we invite participants to participate in, conservatives might be more skeptical of what we tell them, or might be more skeptical of the reasons for the research or whatever. So that's always going to be an obstacle, and I really don't see a great way out of that, unless you can sort of convince people that the space where this study is coming from is not trying to paint them in a bad light, or paint them in a, how do you say that, in a bad picture, that's always going to be a struggle. And yeah, if anyone has any great ideas on how you could convince right-wing people that we're not after them, to maybe there's room for researchers to team up who have very different worldviews, because there are conservative researchers out there who would like to paint an accurate picture, and if you can convince participants that that's what we do, maybe that would help. So yeah, that's a possibility that they adjusted their responses. Whether they would be able to actually do that, so you replicate the pattern on the other side that closely, I'm a little bit skeptical, but it is a possibility that at least some people would do that. We did find one difference between those samples is that, I had a hard time believing the results. And when I read through what participants had actually written, I did notice, or I thought I was noticing a difference in tone in terms of how they were, what they were saying, the words they were using, right? And so I gave the data to someone who can do sentiment analyses, and they did find a difference, that the conservative people were using much more sort of negative emotion and anger and things like that in their word choices. But yeah, if you code it based on our scoring guide and say, well, is this actually referring to the misinformation? There's absolutely nothing in there. In the tone, you could sense reading through the comments that there was a lot more anger and this is just the fake news trying to paint us in a bad light, or put us in a bad light, and you could sense some of that. So yeah, but I really don't have a good answer to how to get around that. So if anyone else has any ideas, I'd be pretty keen to hear them, but it's a good comment. Yeah.
Cool. Then maybe this next question will actually be might be one possible avenue to answer that. So Kevin, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hey, yeah. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks for a great talk. Yeah, it was just I noticed you are starting to look at the temporal dynamics more now, but just from a mechanistic point of view, I was wondering, suppose you have like a two alternative force choice kind of design. They have the original belief, then they have the modified belief. Following your retraction manipulation or what any other manipulation you might have. If you have a response deadline, so you force them to respond really quickly or much slower, do you expect that's going to interact with their endorsement of the original belief or with the manipulations later? I'm thinking more, and this might even tie into the conservative liberal difference. Maybe they're kind of relying more on that fast, kind of quick associative style of thinking. Yeah, and that might show up in the response deadlines in terms, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea. In fact, so great that I had it myself a few years ago. I was coming from, and Simon will be thrilled to hear this, from sort of dual processing angle, where, you know, part of the theorizing is that misinformation responses are more driven by automatic familiarity processes, and it's only when you use sort of slower recollection processes that you, or sort of strategic monitoring processes, that you get to sort of, even if you automatically think of the misinformation, you sort of stop yourself and you don't use it, right? Yes. So I did try that, and I used response deadlines and found absolutely nothing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't. Maybe I should revisit that and again. The only thing that we did find in one of the studies that I mentioned was that if you put people into a public condition where they think their responses are going to be sort of vetted by the group at the end, they take, I think it was about 5 to 6 seconds actually longer on average to give their responses compared to a private condition where, you know, they think their responses are going to remain confidential. So I think that's reasonably strong evidence that they take into account how am I going to be seen, how my beliefs are going to be seen. But yeah, so unfortunately that didn't work, but it's only one study. Maybe I should actually revisit that. So yeah, thanks. Or
maybe another approach. Who knows? Yeah, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, we tried EEG as well, and that turned into a bit of a dog's breakfast, which is, it's always difficult on these long time scales with sentence processing, and so we're trying. We still have a study under review using the EEG, but to be fair, it didn't really.
Right.
Yeah, I probably reject it if I was a reviewer.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, great work nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask?
I'll go back to that yes, asymmetry question. Ullrich, it was a very, very good talk. Thank you very much, and good to see you. And yeah, I'd love to talk more about those sorts of things at a later stage. But you know, there's been a kind of controversy about the asymmetry issue, right? And I've been suspecting that there might have been a bit of a historical change. This is just based on my impression, but especially in the US, things have changed quite a bit. So if you look at the older studies, you know, from the 80s, 90s, the people didn't find a lot of a symmetry. So there was a asymmetry. So the right-wingers tended to be a lot more committed than the kind of wedded sort of views, whereas the left side wasn't like that. But now it seems like there's a much stronger symmetry between the extreme left and the extreme right. And I was wondering about that. Your idea of a political identity being kind of tied up with that sort of thing made sense to me. I kind of like that. But did you have any other sorts of thoughts about that?
Yeah. Like it's crossed my mind as well that maybe what's driving that symmetry that we now observe in the US is that the left-wingers have become more wedded to their ideas, and they've become more like the conservatives used to be, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess that's a possibility, but if you look at the data, the retractions actually have pretty strong effects.
Yes, that's true.
So it doesn't seem that, you know, originally I found that the retractions were ineffective in the right-wingers, so it doesn't seem as if the left-wingers have come up. It sort of seems as if the right-wingers have come down. And there's, you know, a few other studies that have just come out in the last couple of years demonstrating more of the symmetry, right? Finding more motivated reasoning on both groups. And I haven't maybe I should need to look at those a bit more closely to see how they compare to older studies, to see if it's the liberal people changing or the conservative people changing. I really don't have a good answer to that question. But the original study on the undergraduates, I think it went over 2 or 3 years because we struggled so much to find conservative undergraduates. We had to go to the business school and then do things like that. Even there, we struggled to find conservative undergraduates. So, but those data were collected sort of 2016, 17-ish, whereas these were collected the other one, the US data were collected last year. So whether that temporal difference can explain it, I doubt it.
It's hard to tell.
I really don't have a good explanation other than the political centrality or the identity centrality thesis. The data certainly don't seem to suggest that it's the liberal people becoming more entrenched, but yeah.
That sounds interesting. And if you don't mind, I have one more follow-up question about your comment about the kind of emotional or emotive nature of the more conservative people. Do you mind elaborating on that? I have a feeling that actually emotiveness plays a very major role in both the kind of a persistence and of course memorability or the memory persistence, as well as the speed of let's say sharing it with other people. And so yeah, just putting it out there if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean there is evidence obviously that people share stuff that they find emotionally engaging. Again, I've run studies with where I find the emotionality of the materials didn't matter that much. So, you know, I contrasted sort of clearly fictional plane crashes where no one died with a plane crash that I sort of modeled on a real one and pretended that it was a real newspaper report from elsewhere where lots of people died, and we could measure the emotional impact of that story on people. So there was a significant difference in and not only significant, but also substantial difference in how emotionally affected people were by the materials, and that didn't have any impact whatsoever on anything else. So, but in the real world, I don't know. As I said, there was a sense just reading the materials that was a difference in how emotionally engaged participants were, and we could sort of nail that down through that sentiment analysis, but it didn't have any impact at all on the inferences per se, what people, the content of what they were saying, right? They were saying it differently. It was, you know, conservative people were more emotional about it, but didn't sort of share the gist of what they were saying. So, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of anecdotes and a lot of you know, people having a hunch that emotion should be a really important thing, but I'm finding it hard to see that hard evidence in the lab. To be fair, so yeah, maybe I'm just not looking at it in the right way, or yeah.
Be interesting to look at it and the a social effect of those sorts of things. I think would be very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll shut up.
We can talk about that later. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be good. I'd love to catch up sometime. Thanks.
Andy, were you stretching or did you have a question?
I do have a question, but we've also gone over time by a fair bit. So I might just follow up.
Is it a friendly question or a hard question? That will determine whether or not I have an appointment now.
Yeah. It's a complicated question, so I'll send you an email. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, well, we might finish things there and thank Uli with, we'll use our reactions, and thanks a lot, Uli, it was great.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, guys. Yeah, have a good day, all the best.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You too. Well.